We all bring expectations into relationships. We expect certain things out of the relationship, and we have expectations about what we will put into the relationship. Unfortunately, though, oftentimes our expectations and our experience in a relationship don't match up, and there's a gap between the two. By the end of today's session, I want to share with you a powerful truth that will help you fill the gap between your expectations and your experience with something that will help you live in love for the long haul. As a bonus, I'm going to give you a practical challenge this week that will help you put into practice this truth. Because as we've said throughout this entire series, that when you put love into action, you actually feel more attraction. That's why these challenges are so important. Before we get to the truth and the challenge though, there is another hurdle that we need to overcome. So let's go and tackle it together. When I came into the marriage relationship, I brought a number of expectations with me. I brought expectations that, quite frankly, I can't even share on this video because they're a little bit inappropriate. Some of you that are married, you might know what I'm talking about. I had a big expectation that my wife would always be able to drop everything whenever it was necessary in order to join me in something that I thought was important. I had an expectation that she would provide all of the things that I needed emotionally in order to be strong and confident. I had an expectation that she might even fill the gap of being good enough, because I grew up thinking to myself, well, I'm just not good enough at a number of different things, and I felt as though if Kristen were able to come into a marriage relationship with me, she would help me to feel like I was enough. The reality is, all the expectations that I placed on our marriage relationship before we got married were expectations that were way too high for anybody to ever be able to live up to. So what happens when the expectations that you bring into a relationship don't measure up to the experiences that you have in that relationship? Well, oftentimes, like I have, we fill the gap with things that are not healthy for the relationship in the long run. I want us to take a look at a solution that has helped me fill the gap between my expectations and my experiences in a healthy way so that the love in the relationship will last. Let's take a look at that solution. When it comes to the problem of expectations in relationships, we all struggle with this problem. And as we've said throughout this entire series, if it's something we all struggle with, then it means it's hard for us to find examples that help us with the solution. Examples of people that have found lifelong love, not just fallen in love, but stayed in love, that we could mimic or maybe even imitate in order to solve these problems. However, there is a famous passage of an old ancient Christian New Testament scripture that is read at almost every single wedding. Whether it's a Christian wedding or not a Christian wedding, you've probably heard this passage of scripture read at a wedding before. Paul, the writer of this particular passage, he shares with us a descriptor of what love really is. He gives us incredible insight to the full scope and the full volume of what love should look like. And when it comes to our expectations in relationships not matching our experiences and what we do to fill that gap, this particular passage from Paul gives us incredible insight in what we can put in the gap. So let's take a look at Paul's letter. In Paul's letter to these group of Christians that were living in the city of Corinth, in this famous passage that oftentimes is read at weddings, Paul is addressing a major gap that the people of Corinth had when it came to love. Corinth was probably seen as the most party city in all of the world at that time. They had a really bad view of what true love looked like. Think of a place like maybe Amsterdam or Las Vegas. What happened in Corinth, they would say needed to stay in Corinth. That's how bad their view of love really was. Paul, as he addresses this view of love and clarifies for them what love really looks like, gives us some insight when it comes to the expectations that we all bring into relationships. especially gives us insight into what we can put in the gap when there is a gap between our expectations and our experiences. Listen to these words. They may be familiar to you, but because they are familiar, I want to encourage you to lean in a little bit and really listen hard for what Paul is talking about when it comes to love. He says this: love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Now, this final statement from Paul on love is actually the thing that will help us to fill the gap in a healthy way when there is a gap between what we expect and experience. Listen to what he says. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always persevere. Love never fails. So when it comes to those expectations that we bring into a relationship, which we all have, I expected things of my marriage relationship that my wife could never live up to. No human being on the planet could ever fulfill those expectations. So when it comes to filling the gap, when there is an expectation and an experience that don't match up, Paul says that love perseveres. It goes on no matter what. In society today, we actually have a really low pain threshold when it comes to relationships. We oftentimes bail on relationships far too soon. Then when we have persevered through the pain, we may have seen something beautiful on the other side. When it comes to that gap, Paul says that we need to believe the best. We need to protect that person that maybe created the gap. Even though they didn't mean to, perhaps they created the gap, and Paul would say that love believes the best. It protects, it comes to the defense, and ultimately it perseveres, and love never fails. So, on a practical level, what does it look like this week when there is a gap between your expectation and your experience? What does it look like to believe the best, to come to the defense, to protect that person that created the gap? Let's get practical and find out what that looks like. I want to give you a challenge as we wrap up this final session, session 4, to help you put into practice the truth that we've just learned from Paul's letter to those people living in Corinth when there was a gap between their expectation and what they were experiencing in a relationship, and how they could fill the gap with something healthy that would help them to stay in love. Here's the challenge for this week. It's what I'm referring to as the gap challenge. It's identifying when there is a gap in the relationship between an expectation and experience, and then identifying what did you fill the gap with and what would be the most healthy thing to fill that gap with. So here's how it works. Grab a journal, and at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, reflect on the previous day or on that particular day. Identify any gaps in the relationship that you value most and write them down. Write down what was the expectation that you had, identify it, and then write down your experience. For instance, it might be that you expected that person that you really care about to be on time for an appointment that they said they were going to be at 4 o'clock when you were going to pick them up and take them out. Your experience might be that they weren't there on time. In fact, it might be that they showed up a half an hour or an hour late. Your natural response would be to fill the gap with maybe suspicion and a lack of trust, wondering where were they, what were they doing, and why is it that they always seem to be late? Then begin to identify what would be the healthy thing to fill that gap in. To go ahead and write down that believing the best, persevering, and actually coming to the defense of the person that created the gap would be a much healthier way to fill that gap. Each day, I want you to identify at least one gap and how you filled the gap and how you could have filled the gap in a more healthy way. As you do this challenge, I believe it will help you to understand that there always are gaps between what we expect and what we experience, but we hold the key. we hold the decision to what we will fill that gap with. And I want to encourage you to fill it in a healthy way. Now, before I let you go from the house, there's one last thing that I need to remind you about. Now, don't forget, when we started this session, we all said that we bring expectations into relationships that oftentimes are way too high or impossible for the people in those relationships to ever meet. And so because of that, there's a gap between our expectation and what we experience. Imagine at the end of this week, if you do the gap challenge every single day, learning to manage your expectations and to fill that gap with healthy things to make your relationship thrive, the difference that it will make in the relationship that you value most. Imagine what that will look like. And I believe that these 4 challenges, these 4 powerful truths that we've learned in each of these sessions of how to stay in love could literally transform the relationships that you value most and allow you to experience the thing that most people never get to experience, growing old together with the one you love.